Hey you, and welcome. In this video, we will learn to use Firebase authentication. In my contact app right now, you can access it without any authentication, and that's a security risk. I want to put a authentication layer where if you're not authenticated, you should not be able to see the contacts or even add information into the database. So I need to know who you are. In order to do that, we will use Firebase authentication. So let's dive right into it. I'm looking at the documentation for Firestore Firebase authentication, and that's in the authentication section in web. And I'm going to be using Google authentication. There are plenty more of social or even in-house authentication. I just chose Google. That's an easier one to work with and already have an account for it. And in order to work with Google authentication, this is the code base that is available to us. In those code sample, we can see that we're going to have to start working with Firebase/auth instead of Firebase Firestore that we have been working with. We will bring in sign in with pop-up. That is one of the methods. There's also sign in with redirect. I will work with sign in with pop-up. And that's a promise, and we have to await that promise that will return us the user once the authentication is complete. So that's the one we will work with. And in order to do so, if I go back to my VS Code, I will start a new provider that will be a parent provider called auth provider, or let's call it auth context. I believe we called other context, so let's call this auth context. That way we're aligned with the naming convention. And let's start with importing React from React. I will hide my file explorer. This will export a const of auth context or auth provider. Provider will wrap on the parent side, and this will be a function component from React, and it will expect children. So props with children. It's a function component. We will destructure children out, and we will render return self-closing fragment children like so. Perfect. So that's our provider ready to go. Let's start working with context API. So export const auth context, which is a create context function from React, and this will have an object. And initially we will not provide anything. We'll may provide something later on. The whole concept of this is that auth provider will do the authentication for us, and if the authentication is not done, it will hide the entire app. That means no children will be rendered. All right, so let's just save this. Let's go to index.tsx. That's the root of our application. And if I scroll further down, so router provider and contact provider, those are the two places where the queries are being done and the app exists. So above those is where my authentication layer will be. So authentication auth provider, I think I called it. There we go, auto import. And let's nest these all in. There we are, save. And the app should work exactly the same. I haven't done anything yet, but if I go to my auth provider and just instead of returning children, I say return null, that should not return anything. That means the page is empty. So that's the concept here, is that I'm going to check for authentication first. If there's no user authenticated, I will present with a different component altogether. So let's build out that component. I'll go over to my Firefox, and in Chakra templates, there is a section for social media buttons, and that's where I will steal some of the components here. Actually, only one component. I just need this Google button, sign in with Google. So that's the code I need. Let's copy that over. They even center it for us. That's perfect. That's exactly what I needed. I'll go back to my VS Code and paste that code in this return with the parentheses and import things that I need from Chakra UI. So there we are. FC button. That may not be auto importable. We'll bring that in later. Text. Ooh, text didn't work. I'll import that manually. There we are. And then FC Google. Let's bring that in. It's coming from okay, React icons. I think I have that in my library, so that should be just a simple import. Perfect, there we are, center. And let's bring up the Firefox again and VS Code. All right, we're looking good. So sign in with Google button is there. Now we have to make it functional. In order to make this button functional, let's go back to Firefox and I'll look at the documentation and copy paste some of the code here. So we'll work with auth. This get auth will make it consistent with how we had get Firestore in our firebase.ts. So let's go back to VS Code and let's go to firebase.ts, and right at the bottom, that's where we have been exporting our DB analytics app. Let's export auth, get auth, which will come from Firebase Firestore. I think I have to import that manually. Oh, okay. It will come from Firebase auth, not Firestore. Get auth. There we are. We have imported that, and then pass it the app like that. Perfect. Now I have access to the auth variable. So that's first piece of documentation that is done. Next, we have to use this auth variable and call sign in with pop-up and provide it with the auth and the provider. In this case, the provider would be Google Auth Provider. So let's see how we can do that. I'll go back to my VS Code. Seems like my autocorrect has done some work for me, so I'm just going to have to rewrite some code here. Because I returned only one variable, it auto simplified it for me, but I do want to return it in a parentheses. And what I'll do here is call a new const, name it handle sign in with Google. It will be an empty function for now. It will be async. We will be working with some requests. And let's make that so when the button is pressed, on click, call handle sign in with Google. So that will call that function. And next we have to import the provider. So let's copy over this entire line. Great. Oops, didn't do it properly. All right, so we don't need get auth here. We need sign in with a pop-up, and we need Google Auth Provider, which will be passed down as provider. If I go back to my documentation for Firestore, up above, it did tell me how to start a provider right here. So all I have to do is just copy this line, paste it. Let's do it outside of React because it doesn't need to know about React lifecycle methods. It's a static method. And then provider, we will call that sign in with pop-up that we have imported. Pass it the auth, which is coming from utils Firebase, and pass it the provider, which we have already instantiated. This will be a promise. We'll await that and we'll get back something. I go back to documentation. Let's see what it returns. All right, it's going to return a result, and I can use this result to get the user out of it. All right, perfect. So I think TypeScript should help me out here. If I just name it result, and if I was to use result later, TypeScript is telling me you have access to a user object, which is great. So once that is done, I'll store this user in the state. So let's call use state. There we are. Const. I won't know what the type of that would be, right? User credential, result user credential. Okay, let's import that from user credential from Firebase auth directly because they have that interface written for us. And by default, it will be undefined. Call it user, set user, or actually, yeah, that's fine. Set user, pass the whole result to it, and that should work just fine. Perfect. So that way we have access to the user object, and we can say if the user object has value, render children. If it doesn't, then return me other the button, the sign in with Google button. All right, perfect. Let's save that. Let me open my browser and go back to VS Code. What is it complaining about? Auth context, there's a problem. Oh yeah, auth, because children, we cannot just render like that. So we have to JSX fragment that and JavaScript and JSX curlies that, save it. And there we are, it's rendering just fine. Let's try it out. Oh, and it didn't work. Okay, I think I know the reason why, but let me just check it out. I'm gonna check the console and it says configuration not found. And I believe the reason for that is because in my Firebase console, I didn't tell authentication that Google is one of the authentication methods I want to work with. So by default, it's turned off. So let's go to our Firebase console and let's go to authentication in the build section. In here, I haven't really configured it. So let's click on get started and enable Google. So click on Google, enable that. Project name is fine. I will use my email address that I've signed up with as a support email address in case something goes wrong. Great, that took a few seconds and now it's enabled. Let's try it out again and I'll sign in. I did have to refresh my browser and I'll click on signing in with my Google account. So there we are, click on that and that should sign me in. So the sign in is successful and I can see the app, which is great news. I can see the data as well. And if I go over to my Firebase console and go to authentication section, I can see that there is one person who has signed up already, and this is their UID, which is the user ID for this authentication method. So we can see how authentication dashboard starts filling up as the usage goes up. Perfect. Let's do one more thing. If I go back to my VS Code, notice that when I refresh my browser, it asks me to sign in again. And the reason for that is because we're not checking for anything on mount. When the use effect on mount happens, we're not checking if the user is already authenticated. Firebase is smart enough to have a local storage so we can keep track of the session, and the session is alive still. It's just that we're not checking for it. So let's see how we can do that. Back in Firebase documentation, the authentication section, web, instead of Google, let's click on manage users. And that's where we can see how we can look at the state of the authentication change. If I scroll down, the first snippet for code tells me that I can work with on state change and pass it the auth and then give it a callback function. And that callback function will be called when the state of the authentication change, and it will give me the user that I want to work with. So let's go back to VS Code and use the use effect. Give it a function. It will only be called when the mount happens, and that's where I will register on auth state changed, which is coming from Firebase auth. Give it the auth that we have from our utils firebase.ts, so that's the auth, and then give it a callback function. This callback function will give us user as a argument, and we can use this to set our state. So I can just say set user to user and take away set user from line number 28. That means we don't need to worry about awaiting this even. We can just say sign in with pop-up, and that should be enough. So let's just let's not await this. There we are. And then take away the async. Now set user is setting the user object, which is different from user credential. So let me see what the type is. It's a user type. So let's just see if we can get a user type from Firebase auth instead of user credential. And that should stop complaining at this point. Let me just go ahead and save this. Oh, it can be null. So if it's null, let's just, if no user, don't take any action, don't set state or anything like that. I could make so that my state variable, instead of being user, just user, I could make it so that it's null. That works as well, but yeah, let's just do that. Let's take away return. All right. So this way our use effect on mount will register a callback function with Firebase to say when the state of authentication changes, do something with my set user state. So let's go ahead and save this, and I'll refresh my browser and notice that I don't have to sign in anymore. Is because the state of the authentication changes automatically. Perfect. I'll see you all in the next video.